fellow wanderers of Middle-earth, gather close as we explore one of the most profound transformations in all of Tolkien's legendarium. A journey that proves even the deepest hatreds can bloom into the most extraordinary love. Before we begin this gentle exploration together, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. And if these contemplative journeys bring you peace, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our fellowship of the wise. Tonight, we follow the remarkable path that led an elf and a dwarf, from ancient enmity to a friendship so deep it transcended the very boundaries of mortality itself. The weight of 3,000 years pressed down upon that first moment, when Legolas of the Woodland Realm and Gimli son of Gloin found themselves standing in the same council chamber. Between them stretched not merely the physical space of Rivendell's halls, but an abyss carved by generations of mistrust, betrayal, and carefully nurtured hatred. Their peoples had been enemies for so long that the original causes of their conflict had become less important than the tradition of enmity itself. Legolas carried within his immortal memory the stories passed down through his father's house, tales of dwarven greed and treachery that had cost elvish lives and destroyed ancient alliances. The betrayal at Erebor, when King Thrain's grandfather had refused to share the treasures recovered from Smaug's hoard, lived in elvish memory as though it had happened yesterday rather than decades ago. Every dwarf he looked upon wore the face of broken promises and shattered trust. Gimli bore an equally heavy burden of ancestral grievance, his heart hardened by stories of elvish pride and cold indifference to dwarven suffering. His people remembered how the elves had abandoned them when the Balrog drove them from Moria, how Thranduil had imprisoned his father Gloin and refused aid when it was desperately needed. The elves represented everything the dwarves despised about the world above their mountain halls, beings who claimed superiority while offering nothing but judgment and disdain. The very sight of each other triggered responses that had nothing to do with their individual characters and everything to do with the poisonous legacy they had inherited. Legolas saw in Gimli's broad shoulders and braided beard the embodiment of stubborn materialism that valued gold above friendship. Gimli perceived in the elf's graceful movements and ethereal beauty the arrogance of an immortal who had never known genuine hardship or loss. Their initial exchanges crackled with barely contained hostility, each word carefully chosen to wound without quite crossing the line into open insult. They competed rather than cooperated, seeking opportunities to demonstrate their own superiority while highlighting the other's weaknesses. Every interaction became a small battle in the larger war their peoples had been fighting for millennia. Yet beneath this surface antagonism, something else stirred in the depths of both their hearts. Perhaps it was the recognition that they were both strangers in Rivendell's halls, outsiders among the predominantly human and elvish gathering. Perhaps it was the dawning awareness that their mutual enemy represented a threat far greater than any historical grievance between their peoples. The Fellowship's formation would demand that they set aside the comfortable certainties of ancestral hatred and learn to see each other as individuals, rather than representatives of opposing races. This requirement would prove more challenging than any physical obstacle they would face on their journey, asking them to abandon the very foundations upon which their identities had been built. Neither could imagine, in those early days, that the bond forming between them would eventually become the most treasured relationship of their long lives. A friendship so profound it would rewrite the history of relations between their peoples and become a legend told in both Elvish and dwarven halls for generations yet to come. The mines of Moria provided the crucible where ancient prejudices first began to crack under the pressure of shared peril. In those lightless depths where Balrog fire had once consumed an entire civilization, Legolas and Gimli found themselves forced to rely upon skills that transcended the petty boundaries of racial pride. The darkness cared nothing for their inherited hatreds, demanding only competence and courage from those who dared enter its domain. Gimli's knowledge of stone and tunnel became their lifeline in passages where even elvish senses failed to penetrate the oppressive gloom. His ability to read the language written in rock and mortar, to understand the intentions of long-dead builders through the evidence they left in their construction, proved invaluable when the Fellowship faced choices that could lead to salvation or destruction. Legolas watched with growing amazement as the dwarf interpreted clues invisible to all others. The elf's supernatural grace and deadly accuracy with his bow created a protective umbrella under which the entire company could move with greater confidence. His arrows found their marks in darkness so complete that ordinary warriors would have been reduced to helpless flailing. Gimli observed these displays of skill with the appreciative eye of a craftsman, recognizing mastery in another's work. When orcs attacked in those echoing halls, their differences became complementary strengths rather than sources of friction. Legolas struck from distance with precision that never wasted a shot, while Gimli anchored their defense with the immovable determination that characterizes dwarven warfare at its finest. They began to fight not as reluctant allies, but as partners whose abilities enhanced each other's effectiveness. The first glimmer of genuine respect emerged when Gimli witnessed Legolas risk his own safety to retrieve a fallen comrade's pack from a precarious ledge. The action served no strategic purpose and offered no opportunity for glory. Yet the elf undertook it without hesitation, simply because it was the right thing to do. This small act of courage shattered Gimli's assumption that elves cared only for their own welfare. Legolas experienced his own moment of revelation when he saw Gimli refuse to abandon a search for Balin's tomb, despite the obvious danger such delay invited. The dwarf's loyalty to the memory of a kinsman, his willingness to risk the mission for the sake of honoring the dead, revealed depths of character that transcended stereotypical dwarven obsession with material gain. Here was someone who understood that some things mattered more than practical considerations. Their competition evolved from hostile rivalry into something approaching mutual challenge. When Legolas demonstrated impossible feats of agility, Gimli responded not with resentment, but with displays of dwarven endurance that proved equally impressive. They began to push each other toward excellence, rather than seeking opportunities for humiliation. The gradual recognition of each other's competence created space for curiosity about the cultures that had produced such unexpected capabilities. Gimli found himself wondering what kind of training could develop Legolas's supernatural coordination. Legolas began to question his assumptions about dwarven society. If it could nurture such fierce loyalty and unshakable determination, small gestures of consideration replaced the careful formality that had characterized their early interactions. Legolas began adjusting his pace to accommodate shorter dwarven legs, without making the accommodation obvious. Gimli started sharing his knowledge of underground navigation without waiting to be asked, offering information freely rather than hoarding it as a source of advantage. By the time they emerged from Moria's shadow, something fundamental had shifted between them. They remained members of historically antagonistic peoples, but they had begun to see each other as individuals worthy of respect, rather than merely as representatives of ancient grievances. The foundation for something far greater than mutual tolerance had been quietly established. In those dark passages beneath the misty mountains. The loss of Gandalf in Moria's depths stripped away the last barriers between Legolas and Gimli, leaving them exposed to grief that transcended all boundaries of race and ancient grudge. In the face of such overwhelming sorrow, their inherited hatreds revealed themselves as petty luxuries that the bereaved could no longer afford. Pain became the universal language that finally allowed them to speak to each other's hearts rather than their prejudices. Legolas found himself seeking comfort not from Aragorn or Boromir, whose human responses felt alien to his immortal perspective on loss, but from Gimli, whose deep capacity for mourning matched the intensity of his own grief. The dwarf understood that some wounds cut too deeply for quick healing, that proper respect for the fallen required time and silence, rather than hasty attempts at consolation. Gimli discovered that elvish sorrow possessed a terrible beauty that humbled his assumptions about their emotional superficiality. Legolas wept for Gandalf with the accumulated weight of centuries, each tear carrying the memory of all the partings his immortal life had forced him to endure. The dwarf realized that longevity brought not indifference, but an ever-deepening capacity for pain. Their shared watch over the Fellowship's camp during those dark nights following Moria created intimacy born of mutual vulnerability. Neither could sleep easily while the other stood guard alone, so they took to keeping vigil together, finding solace in silent companionship that required no words to communicate understanding. The darkness that had once seemed like an enemy became a gentle blanket that sheltered their growing bond. When Uruk-hai pursued them across Rohan's grasslands, their partnership deepened into something approaching brotherhood. Legolas learned to trust Gimli's judgment about pace and endurance, recognizing that dwarven stamina operated by different principles than elvish grace, but proved equally reliable. Gimli began to depend on the elf's superior vision and hearing, accepting guidance without the sting of wounded pride that such reliance might once have caused. The rescue of Merry and Pippin at Isengard revealed how completely their priorities had aligned around protecting what mattered most to their companions. Neither hesitated to charge into battle against overwhelming odds when their friend's safety hung in the balance. The cause they served had become more important than personal survival, creating the foundation for trust deeper than any sworn oath. During quiet moments between crises, they began to share stories that revealed the hearts beneath their cultural armor. Gimli spoke of the songs his people sang while working deep beneath the mountains, melodies that connected them to stone and fire in ways outsiders rarely understood. Legolas described the way trees communicated across vast forests, sharing wisdom accumulated over centuries of patient growth. These exchanges created bridges between worldviews that had seemed irreconcilably different. Gimli began to perceive the living intelligence that Legolas detected in growing things, while the elf started to appreciate the profound relationship between dwarves and the bones of the earth itself. Their differences became sources of fascination, rather than irritation. The gradual erosion of their defensive barriers allowed vulnerability to replace suspicion in their interactions. They no longer needed to prove their worth to each other through displays of skill or knowledge. Simply being present during difficult moments provided sufficient demonstration of their commitment to the bond growing between them. By the time they reached the gates of Minas Tirith, they had become something their peoples would struggle to understand. More than allies, deeper than friends, they had forged a connection that transcended the categories their cultures used to define relationships. The ancient grudges that had shaped their early encounters seemed like memories from someone else's life, replaced by loyalty that would endure beyond the boundaries of mortality itself. The moment Gimli first glimpsed the glittering caves of Aglarond through Legolas's eyes marked a transformation deeper than any political alliance or battlefield brotherhood. For centuries, the dwarf had seen stone as material to be shaped in gold, as treasure to be hoarded. But the elf's genuine amazement at the underground cathedral's crystalline beauty revealed possibilities that Gimli's own people had never taught him to perceive. Legolas stood in those caverns, with the wonder of someone discovering an entirely new form of art. His immortal eyes, trained to find beauty in the play of light through leaves, and the graceful arch of branches against sky, now traced the same aesthetic principles in formations of living rock. The way water had carved these chambers over millennia suddenly seemed as purposeful and lovely as any grove shaped by patient gardeners. "You have shown me something I never knew existed," the elf whispered as they moved through passages that gleamed with their own inner light. His words carried the weight of genuine revelation rather than mere politeness. Here was beauty that rivaled anything the forests could offer, created through processes as ancient and mysterious as the growth of the oldest trees. Gimli felt his understanding of his own heritage expanding in ways that left him almost dizzy with new appreciation. These caves had always been valuable to his people for their defensive positions and mineral wealth, but seeing them through elvish perception revealed a treasury of wonder that no amount of gold could purchase. Beauty that existed for its own sake rather than for any practical purpose. When Legolas led Gimli into the heart of Fangorn Forest, the dwarf experienced an equally profound shift in perception. The ancient trees that had always seemed like obstacles or resources suddenly revealed themselves as living beings with their own forms of consciousness and wisdom. Their massive trunks and spreading branches created architecture as magnificent as any dwarven hall, built through patience that spanned centuries. The forest's subtle music, normally inaudible to non-elvish ears, gradually became perceptible to Gimli through his friend's gentle guidance. Legolas taught him to hear the conversations carried on wind through rustling leaves, the slow songs that trees sang to encourage each other's growth. What had once seemed like random noise transformed into symphony of remarkable complexity and beauty. "Your people understand creation in ways mine never imagined," Gimli admitted as they sat beneath an oak whose trunk required 20 dwarves holding hands to encircle. The admission cost him nothing because it had ceased to feel like defeat. Instead, it represented expansion of his capacity to appreciate the full richness of Middle-earth's wonders. Legolas learned to see stone not as dead matter, but as another form of life operating on timescales too vast for quick comprehension. The crystals in Aglaron's depths grew and changed as surely as any tree, simply following rhythms measured in millennia rather than seasons. This revelation connected Elvish and Dwarven aesthetics at their deepest levels, revealing shared appreciation for beauty that emerged through patient time. Their exchanges of wonder created new forms of joy that belonged entirely to their friendship. Neither could have discovered these expanded perspectives alone, for they required the generous sharing of sight itself. Through Legolas's eyes, Gimli learned to perceive the living sculpture that water and time created in stone. Through Gimli's vision, Legolas discovered the profound satisfaction that comes from understanding how beauty emerges. Through the marriage of design and material, this mutual gift of enhanced perception transformed both their worldviews and their friendship into something unprecedented in the history of their peoples. They had become not just allies or even brothers, but teachers and students in the grand curriculum of appreciating all the forms that beauty could take in the world they shared. The news of Legolas and Gimli's growing friendship reached their respective peoples, like ripples from a stone cast into still water, creating disturbances that spread far beyond the immediate circle of those who witnessed it firsthand. In the halls of Thranduil's palace, Elvish courtiers struggled to understand how one of their own could find companionship among a race they had long considered crude and grasping. The very concept challenged assumptions so fundamental that many refused to believe the reports until multiple sources confirmed the impossible truth. Gimli's kinsmen in Erebor reacted with equal bewilderment and concern when word reached them of his bond with an elf. Dwarven society had been built upon principles of insularity and mistrust of outsiders, particularly those whose immortal perspectives seemed to mock the urgency that characterized mortal existence. The idea that one of their own had chosen to share confidences with a being who would outlive entire dwarven generations felt like betrayal of everything their culture held sacred. Yet neither friend allowed the disapproval of their peoples to weaken the bond they had forged through shared trials and mutual discovery. They understood that their friendship represented something larger than personal preference, a living demonstration that the ancient hatreds dividing their races served no purpose, beyond perpetuating suffering that benefited no one. Their connection had become a bridge spanning an abyss that had seemed unbridgeable for 3,000 years. The practical implications of their partnership began to manifest in ways that forced both peoples to reconsider long-held beliefs about their fundamental incompatibility. When Gimli sought Legolas's counsel on matters of diplomacy, Elvish wisdom proved surprisingly applicable to dwarven concerns. When Legolas requested Gimli's advice about craftsmanship, dwarven expertise enhanced Elvish projects in unexpected ways. Their collaboration revealed that many of the differences their peoples had emphasized were superficial variations on deeper similarities that had been deliberately ignored. Both races possessed profound appreciation for beauty, though they found it in different forms. Both valued loyalty and courage, though they expressed these virtues according to different customs. Both had suffered losses that shaped their worldviews, though they processed grief through different rituals. The friendship began to attract attention from members of both communities, who had grown weary of the traditional hostilities that served no practical purpose in an age when greater threats demanded cooperation. Younger elves and dwarves especially found themselves curious about the possibilities that Legolas and Gimli's bond represented, wondering whether the hatred their elders insisted upon was truly necessary or merely habitual. Resistance to their friendship came primarily from those whose identities had become so intertwined with ancient grievances that abandoning them felt like losing themselves entirely. These individuals viewed the growing bond between elf and dwarf as dangerous precedent that threatened the very foundations of racial distinctiveness they believed essential to their people's survival. But the friends themselves had moved far beyond the need for external validation of their connection. They had discovered that true understanding transcended the artificial boundaries their cultures had constructed around acceptable relationships. Their bond had become self-sustaining, nourished by daily interactions that proved more valuable than any approval their peoples might offer or withhold. The pattern they established through their friendship would eventually inspire others to question whether the hatreds they had inherited served any purpose beyond limiting their own capacity for joy and understanding. They had become living proof that love could flourish even in soil that had been poisoned by centuries of carefully cultivated mistrust. Trust between Legolas and Gimli developed not through grand gestures or sworn oaths, but through the accumulation of countless small moments when each chose vulnerability over protection. The first time Gimli allowed himself to sleep deeply while the elf kept watch, he crossed a threshold that years of cultural conditioning had warned him never to approach. Elves were supposed to be unreliable, self-serving creatures who would abandon allies the moment circumstances turned difficult. Yet Legolas proved worthy of that trust night after night, standing guard with the same unwavering attention he would have devoted to protecting his own kin. His vigil extended beyond mere duty to encompass genuine care for his friend's welfare. When exhaustion finally claimed the dwarf's stubborn consciousness, the elf ensured that his rest remained undisturbed by danger or discomfort. Legolas experienced his own moment of profound trust, when injury left him temporarily dependent on Gimli's strength and protection. An elvish warrior accepting help from a dwarf violated every principle of racial superiority his people had taught him to embrace. The admission of weakness felt like betrayal of his entire cultural identity. But Gimli's response to his friend's vulnerability revealed depths of compassion that shattered the last remnants of Legolas's inherited prejudices. The dwarf tended his wounds with gentle skill, shared his own provisions without complaint, and stood ready to defend him with the fierce loyalty that characterized the finest aspects of dwarven nature. His care transcended obligation to become an expression of genuine love. Their friendship created its own private language of gestures and glances that communicated understanding without need for words. A slight nod from Gimli could convey complete confidence in whatever course of action Legolas proposed. A barely perceptible smile from the elf expressed appreciation for his friend's counsel more eloquently than any speech. This silent communication developed through countless hours spent in each other's company, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed inner thoughts and feelings. Gimli's beard carried tension in its braids when he wrestled with difficult decisions. Legolas's eyes took on a distant quality when memories of loss threatened to overwhelm his normally composed demeanor. The trust they built proved strong enough to withstand the pressures that destroyed lesser friendships. When others questioned their bond or suggested that political considerations should override personal loyalty, they found themselves united in defense of what they had created together. Their friendship had become more precious than the approval of their respective peoples. Each act of faith strengthened the foundation they had laid, creating a structure capable of supporting whatever weight the future might place upon it. They had learned to trust not only each other's intentions, but also each other's judgment in matters that affected their mutual welfare. This confidence transformed them from allies into something approaching family. The language of trust they developed together would become the model for future cooperation between their peoples. Their example demonstrated that elves and dwarves could share genuine intimacy without sacrificing their distinct cultural identities. Love had proven stronger than the hatred that had divided their races for millennia. The Legolas who had first entered Rivendell's council chamber bore little resemblance to the being who now walked beside his dwarven companion through the peaceful valleys of Ithilien. Centuries of elvish isolation had shaped him into someone who viewed the world primarily through the lens of his own people's ancient wisdom and timeless concerns. His perspective had been broad in scope, but narrow in sympathy, encompassing vast stretches of time, while remaining largely indifferent to the struggles of shorter-lived races. Gimli's friendship had taught him to value the intense immediacy that characterized mortal existence, the way finite lifespans could transform ordinary moments into treasures worth cherishing. Through dwarven eyes, he learned to see each day not as another identical unit in an endless sequence, but as a unique opportunity that would never come again. This urgency brought new depth to his appreciation of beauty and meaning. The elf discovered that wisdom could emerge from sources his people had long dismissed as inconsequential. Gimli's insights into the nature of friendship, forged through the dwarven understanding that time together was precious precisely because it was limited, revealed truths that immortal beings often overlooked. The dwarf's perspective on love and loss carried weight that centuries of elvish philosophy had failed to capture. Gimli underwent an equally profound transformation through his association with immortal consciousness that could perceive patterns invisible to mortal sight. His dwarven heritage had taught him to focus on immediate concerns and tangible achievements, to measure success through concrete accomplishments that could be touched and counted. Legolas's friendship expanded his vision to encompass possibilities that stretched far beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. The dwarf learned to appreciate the patient rhythms that governed the growth of living things, understanding for the first time why elves could invest decades in projects that would not bear fruit for generations. Through immortal eyes, he glimpsed the vast tapestries of cause and effect that connected present actions to distant consequences, seeing how individual choices rippled outward through time in ways that mortal perception could rarely detect. Legolas's influence helped Gimli recognize that his own craftsmanship participated in the same eternal processes that shaped mountains and grew forests. The weapons and jewelry he created with hammer and forge were not separate from nature, but part of the ongoing collaboration between conscious intention and natural materials. His work became a form of partnership with the earth itself, rather than mere exploitation of its resources. Both friends discovered that their transformed perspectives enhanced rather than diminished their connections to their own peoples and traditions. Legolas's new appreciation for mortal concerns made him a more effective advocate for elvish involvement in the affairs of shorter-lived races. Gimli's expanded vision allowed him to see how dwarven craftsmanship served purposes that transcended immediate utility. Their friendship had become a bridge between worldviews that had seemed fundamentally incompatible, proving that understanding could flourish even between beings whose basic assumptions about existence differed dramatically. They had not abandoned their distinctive cultural identities, but had enriched them through exposure to radically different ways of perceiving reality. The transformation worked both ways, creating a reciprocal enhancement that benefited each friend equally. Neither dominated the relationship or served merely as teacher to the other. Instead, they had become collaborative explorers of possibilities that neither could have discovered alone. Partners in the ongoing project of expanding their capacity for wonder and understanding. Their example would inspire future generations of both elves and dwarves to question the limitations their cultures had placed on acceptable relationships and forms of wisdom. They had proven that love could not only bridge ancient hatreds, but could actually transform the lovers into better versions of themselves than they had ever imagined possible. The qualities that had once seemed like insurmountable barriers between Legolas and Gimli gradually revealed themselves as complementary strengths that made their partnership more powerful than either could have achieved alone. Where the elf's immortal perspective sometimes led to paralysis through over-analysis of distant consequences, the dwarf's mortal urgency provided the decisive action needed in critical moments. When Gimli's intense focus on immediate problems threatened to blind him to larger patterns, Legolas's broader vision offered guidance that prevented costly mistakes. Their contrasting approaches to problem-solving created a natural system of checks and balances that improved their decision-making in ways that surprised them both. Legolas's tendency toward careful deliberation forced Gimli to consider implications he might otherwise overlook in his eagerness to act. Gimli's impatience with excessive planning pushed Legolas toward commitments that might otherwise remain forever theoretical. The elf's supernatural grace and fluid movement provided reconnaissance capabilities that opened tactical possibilities unavailable to more conventional warriors. His ability to move silently through terrain that would betray other travelers gave their partnership access to information and positions that could prove decisive in dangerous situations. Legolas became their eyes and ears in environments where stealth mattered more than strength. Gimli's unshakable determination and defensive expertise created the stable foundation that allowed Legolas's more mobile tactics to achieve maximum effectiveness. The dwarf's ability to hold ground against overwhelming odds gave his friend the security needed to take calculated risks that could change the course of entire battles. Their combination of mobility and stability proved far superior to either approach used in isolation. Their different relationships with time enriched their shared experiences in ways that neither had anticipated. Legolas's immortal memory preserved moments that Gimli's mortal mind might have forgotten, while the dwarf's awareness of time's passage gave urgency and poignancy to pleasures that the elf might otherwise take for granted. Together, they achieved a balance between preservation and appreciation that enhanced their capacity for joy. The elf's connection to growing things provided insights into natural processes that expanded Gimli's understanding of his own craft, while the dwarf's knowledge of worked stone and metal revealed possibilities in the natural world that Legolas had never considered. Their exchange of expertise created new forms of beauty that drew upon both traditions while belonging fully to neither. Legolas's diplomatic skills and cultural sophistication smoothed their path through societies that might otherwise have viewed Gimli's blunt manner with suspicion or hostility. The dwarf's reputation for honesty and straightforward dealing earned them trust in situations where elvish eloquence might have seemed manipulative or insincere. Their different social strengths opened doors that would have remained closed to either alone. The contrast between Gimli's passionate intensity and Legolas's serene composure created emotional balance that helped both friends weather the psychological demands of their adventures. When the dwarf's fierce emotions threatened to overwhelm his judgment, the elf's calm presence provided stabilizing influence. When Legolas's controlled demeanor risked becoming cold detachment, Gimli's warmth reminded him of the importance of feeling deeply. Their friendship had transformed difference from source of conflict into foundation for mutual enhancement. Rather than demanding that either abandon his distinctive qualities, their bond had allowed both to become more fully themselves. While gaining access to capabilities they could never have developed independently, they had proven that love could. The decision that would define the ultimate depth of Legolas and Gimli's friendship came not during their shared adventures, but in the quiet years that followed, when age began to silver the dwarf's beard, while his immortal companion remained unchanged by the passage of time. Gimli watched his mortal body grow heavy with years, while Legolas retained the eternal youth that marked all elves. The approaching separation that mortality demanded should have cast shadow over their remaining time together. Yet their bond had grown so strong that even death seemed like an obstacle to be overcome, rather than an inevitable ending to be accepted. Gimli's love for his friend had become the defining relationship of his life, more precious than clan loyalty or racial identity. The thought of eternal separation felt like denial of everything their friendship had proven about the possibility of transcending the boundaries that supposedly divided different peoples. Legolas faced his own crisis as the sea longing that called all elves eventually westward grew stronger with each passing year. The immortal wanderer, who had once viewed Middle-earth as temporary assignment, now found himself torn between the summons of his people and devotion to a friend whose mortal nature should have made their parting inevitable. His heart refused to accept that love must yield to the biological limitations of different species. The solution they discovered together violated every precedent in the history of both their peoples, while creating new possibilities that neither elf nor dwarf had ever imagined. When Legolas finally built his grey ship to sail into the west, Gimli stood beside him on the dock, not as the friend being left behind, but as companion chosen for the journey itself. Their bond had become strong enough to bridge even the gap between mortal and immortal destinies. Gimli's passage to the Undying Lands represented an unprecedented act of divine grace that recognized the transformative power of perfect friendship. Never before had a dwarf been granted permission to enter the realm reserved for immortal beings. His presence on that ship testified to love so pure and complete that it had earned exception to the fundamental laws governing the separation of mortal and immortal fates. The choice required both friends to abandon everything familiar and venture into unknown territory where the rules that had once seemed absolute no longer applied. Gimli left behind not only his homeland, but his very nature as mortal being, trusting that friendship could sustain him in a realm where he had no natural place. Legolas accepted responsibility for a companion whose presence would forever mark him as different from his immortal kindred. Their journey westward became the final proof that love could indeed conquer every obstacle that fate and nature placed in its path. The ship that carried them toward the undying lands bore more than two friends seeking eternal companionship. It carried the living demonstration that connection between souls could transcend every limitation that the world attempted to impose upon it. The friendship that had begun in mutual suspicion and ancient hatred had evolved into something so extraordinary that it required divine intervention to reach its natural conclusion. Their bond had become the exception that proved the rule about what was possible. When two beings committed themselves completely to understanding and cherishing each other despite every reason their cultures provided for remaining separate. The story of Legolas and Gimli's extraordinary friendship spread throughout Middle-earth like seed carried on favorable winds, taking root in hearts that had grown weary of ancient hatreds that served no purpose beyond perpetuating pain. Their bond became proof that the most fundamental barriers between peoples could be overcome through patient understanding and willingness to see beyond the limitations that tradition imposed upon possibility. Young elves and dwarves began to question whether the enmity their elders demanded was truly necessary or merely inherited habit. Diplomatic relations between the woodland realm and Erebor underwent transformation that seemed miraculous to those who remembered the bitter centuries of mutual mistrust and carefully nurtured grievances. Ambassadors who had once met only to exchange formal complaints now gathered to explore opportunities for cooperation that neither people had previously imagined possible. Trade agreements replaced territorial disputes as both cultures discovered that their differences could create mutual benefit rather than inevitable conflict. The glittering caves that Gimli established beneath Helm's Deep became a symbol of what could be achieved when elvish vision combined with dwarven craftsmanship in service of shared beauty rather than competitive dominance. Legolas's frequent visits to admire the work being done there demonstrated that friendship could flourish even when friends chose different paths through life. Their collaboration proved that love did not require identical goals, only mutual respect and genuine appreciation for each other's gifts. Children born in the years following the War of the Ring grew up hearing tales of the elfin dwarf, whose friendship had rewritten the possibilities available to their peoples. These stories carried power that formal treaties could never match, planting seeds of hope in young minds that had not yet been poisoned by the inherited prejudices that had shaped their parents' worldviews. The next generation began to imagine futures where cooperation replaced conflict as the natural state of relations between different peoples. The friendship's influence extended far beyond the immediate relationship between elves and dwarves to inspire similar reconciliations throughout Middle-earth. Communities that had been divided by old grievances found courage to attempt conversations that previous generations had declared impossible. Legolas and Gimli's example provided a template for overcoming hatred that had seemed permanent and inevitable. Their bond demonstrated that love possessed transformative power that could not be defeated by any force that sought to divide conscious beings from one another. The connection they had forged proved stronger than death itself, transcending the biological limitations that should have made their friendship temporary, and replacing them with unity that would endure throughout eternity. Their love had literally rewritten the laws governing what was possible between mortal and immortal natures. The legacy they left behind offered hope to anyone who had ever been told that certain relationships were forbidden or impossible because of differences that could not be changed. Their friendship became a beacon that guided others toward the understanding that love recognizes no boundaries that the heart refuses to accept. The barriers that divide people exist primarily in minds that have been taught to fear what they do not understand. In the peace of the undying lands, their friendship continues as living testimony to the truth that connection between souls remains the most powerful force in creation. Their bond proves that when two beings commit themselves completely to understanding and cherishing each other, they participate in the same divine love that shaped the music of creation itself. Let this gentle meditation on friendship's triumph over ancient hatred carry you peacefully into dreams, where love conquers every obstacle and understanding bridges every gap that seems too wide to cross.